What's good, everybody? My name is Alckemy. Welcome to the channel. Today we are going to be figuring out how to make percussive top loops kind of like this. Now there's a lot of glitchy sounds and whatnot that's kind of coming about, but I still feel like it has a little bit of a natural kind of sound to it. And then as you can tell, it's also very offset and very swung. And I'm going to be talking about some of the dynamics behind that. So if you're brand new to the channel, I would invite you to check out all the stuff that I have. And if you're interested in figuring out how I make my kicks and snares, as you've heard in a loop like this, I've already got master classes up for those available in the Arcana members. I'm currently working on my own version of how to make music like this as a masterclass, but I'm doing a lot of precursor videos first, and this is included because I'm going to be using these tools that I would hope that you have already watched in which to build on some of those principles and foundations on. So the premise behind this is that I typically used to make percussion and anything of that sort out of neurobase by resampling, and while I will be covering that in a different video at some point in time, I do it this way now because it's a little bit easier and I have a little bit more control. But the reason why I do all that in the first place is because I cannot stand scrolling through just trying to look for loops, finding one that fits, dragging it in, does it work? No. Because a lot of times, especially at the beginning stage, if you use a loop, you often don't see the sound for what it could be outside of the loop itself or outside of the preset itself. And so I think that by forcing yourself to make some stuff and making changes to it, it can help you evolve and teach you the skill of adaptation whenever your sound isn't working in particular. Now, by all means, you can definitely drag a loop in and start to do stuff to make it work and all that, but it's just a pitfall that I've particularly run into. So I just wanted to, toss that out there as some friendly advice. Now, this stuff generally was made in Faceplant, and what we're going to be looking at is pretty much a generator. And if you've been keeping up with the channel, you know that I do neurobase, you know that I do these generative sounds and stuff. But one of the biggest things that I've run into is how do I apply it in context to a tune? And that's kind of where my sound design journey has kind of brought me up to this point of trying to figure all that stuff out of like, all right, well, all this stuff is random, but how do we control the chaos? No pun intended. Shout out to the hedgehog. Sonic Adventure 2, anybody? Leave me in the comment sections, let me know. So in regards to that, we're kind of working towards that, especially with the the Eternum stuff. Everything starts with A, it's really confusing, but with the Eternum stuff that I make of like the neurobase that also has the generative things and just figuring out how to contextualize that better. And what we've come across within this is amalgamating our generative patch to something that still has randomness to it, but also has percussive lines and offbeat rhythms that we can pull from by only making one instance of resampling. So let's talk about the patch itself. And if you like this kind of stuff, be sure to like and subscribe and sit through the entire video because you're going to learn something really cool. And you might even find that you already know how to do this in your own way. So let's get to it. Now, I typically start off with a sine wave and a limiter because whenever you are doing experimental things, you never know what's going to come about. And I generally turn everything to like -2. I didn't do that on this, but that's just a good practice. So no matter what you send through it, it's going to be -2 decibels. That way you can always turn it back up, whatever. So if I were to play this, nothing is going to happen. And that is because we need one of these LFOs to control the amp. Now, this is probably the most important piece of this because once you have something like a multi-stage envelope that has these little percussive saws, then you're already creating percussion. Now, even though this sine wave has a tone, you can see that there's a rhythm to it, even if it doesn't follow the BPM. So if you were to even bounce this out, you're already giving yourself a starting point of typical like percussive loops, I guess, building your own thing that you can use to your advantage in order to start to shape or to, mangle or resample in repitch mode or XYZ. So starting with this and just making something of this nature is the most important piece. And then everything that comes after that is kind of just shaping the tones and the timbre and all that, right? But if you don't know what to do, just make some little triangles like this and put them in arbitrary places and then adjust the speed to your liking. So what I have next is a little bit of FM with just another sine wave, and that sounds like this. It's starting to sound a little bit more physical now, and the way that you achieve that is by FMing or PMing, doesn't really matter, the original oscillator by an arbitrary harmonic. And it's really neat how things work within ratios and stuff, but I'm just going to give you the shortcut version where if you FM something with an imperfect ratio or with an arbitrary ratio, literally just FM this and then grab the harmonic and like scroll up and down, you'll start to get metallic or physical sounding things. That's all you got for it. I do have some unison on this that has a little bit of detuning. It's not absolutely necessary, but sometimes I like to spread the sounds out and see what happens. But once you have that, you've got this really cool percussive loop that sounds like that. Now, these definitely have a tone, which is something to consider, but you can always destroy it more by changing the harmonic or whatever. And of course, even if you can't tell what tone it is, if you press another key, it's going to play a different pitch. So that's something to be mindful of as well. Now, the second oscillator that I have is pretty much the same thing. It's just a little bit of white noise, but it's got a high pass filter on it. And this is the exact same, I guess, percussive multi-stage envelope as the other one. I just duplicated it. Now the thing with this though is that you can shift the phase of this in order to create different variations, but now what you're doing is actually creating a piece of like a percussive loop. So if you keep everything in phase, then everything will play together. But you can see here that just by having very simple stuff, we're already creating percussive loops and whatever. So the next piece after that is just to start to introduce some effects. So the first thing that I have here is a pitch shifter, and it's not doing anything unless if one of these randomizers are active. So I'm not sure which one it is, but I'm going to activate them all because we're going to turn these effects on one by one. But for this, we're going to use this to manipulate the pitch, and we're going to get variations from that. So let's take a listen to that. Now, as you may have noticed, even though this pitch is becoming random, the speed of these two are actually being randomized as well. And so that's kind of the key to this. If you want to create something that's like infinitely generating stuff that's not the same, of having some kind of speed, and that's why I actually don't use BPMs. I just use something like Hertz, because once you balance this out, you don't know what it's going to be, but you might get something that has a natural rhythm on its own. So by randomizing the speed here, by changing it faster and slower, you're still getting the same, I guess, like multi-stage envelope shapes, but it's changing the rate at which that's playing back. And that's really what's important for getting these ideas. So with all that into account, we can pretty much just continue of modulating and randomizing the pitch that we have. Then we have a chorus, which isn't really doing anything other than adding some stereo. Then we have a frequency shifter, which is also changing the pitch. Now this is crazy. You literally want to do this maybe no more than 5%. I would say even 2% would be good. And the reason why is because this adjusts the pitch so much from minus 5K to plus 5K. So the frequency range at which this value covers is really immense. And you really have to be very careful with that. We don't have to be careful, but if you're trying to get predictable results or something that's not too extreme, then you literally only want to do this maybe like from 0 to 5% at the most. So the next thing that we have is a ring mod, and this is just being modulated by the frequency. The frequency is being randomized rather. And you can see that when the frequency changes on that, it's a ring mod, so that means that the speed at which the ring mod is playing, about how fast it rotates or creates a revolution, is being adjusted in that way. And so that's why you're getting more pitch stuff that sounds really interesting and even more metallic. So by modulating that in itself, you're essentially changing the pitch as well, but it's interesting that it also gives you that more organic, natural, I guess, timbre. Next up, we've got a randomized delay. And this is just a really short delay that kind of changes every once in a while. And this is going to give us some cool pitch whips. Now for this in particular, you want to set it to a relatively short delay and then like make it not too long, because you want to keep it within the realm of what it's doing now. If you were to make this super extreme, then you're going to get these really hard and sometimes really loud and really sharp sounds. And to be fair, actually, for this in particular, this doesn't sound too bad. So, definitely experiment, but that's why we have that limiter on the other end, because when you start stacking delays and you're stacking feedback, sometimes it can get pretty nuts. So because we're creating percussion, we do want this to be somewhat transient. So I've introduced just a compressor with a long attack. That's what helps create the transient with a long release and turn the makeup gain up. This is going to make this a lot louder. And so to kind of like summarize all of this stuff, we have used a multi-stage envelope that is creating percussion, and we've set certain parameters that are being randomized in order to change everything within those percussive envelopes. And that way the randomization can run rampant, but no matter what, it's going to be controlled by these little triangles here, or these little shapes or Doritos or whatever you want to call them. So that way it still has a matter of maintaining a piece of rhythm to it. And with this, I know that I didn't really describe of like, do this at this o'clock, do this at this o'clock, whatever, because that's not really what's important about this. It's understanding the philosophy behind how to create this and how to make it usable within the context of your tune. And once you have that fundamental setup, then anything that you choose to randomize is going to be trumped by the MSEG, or the multi-stage envelope generator. So that's pretty much the sound design aspect of it. When you actually get into the application, what I've done is just bounced out an 8-bar loop, kind of like this, and you can see that this is essentially this, or this is essentially this. And I found just a few little rhythms and stuff in between that I liked, and came over here, and I literally started my tune with this first track here, which is very simple. So I'll just play this piece because that's the first thing that you're going to notice. So let's listen to this. Now the reason why it sounds so quiet is because it's being ducked by the sidechain, but I've also pulled a hat from the same loop and just changed the color. So this little guy right here helps us create some of the rhythm. This guy right here is actually just a resample of this one. So I found something that I liked, and it sounds like this. And then next up, we have this little green guy, which is a resample of the entire percussive group with a bunch of effects applied, but it still applies to the same thing, because without this stuff, we're not going to get anything related to the sort. So take a listen to that. Let's just go ahead and solo the whole percussion group. And we've also got this little guy right here that sounds like a snare, but this is outside of the percussive group because I don't want this to be sidechained. And now to kind of finish everything off, the way that I got this swing was through a couple of different ways. The first is, if you take a look, even though this beat is on grid by the clip, the actual waveform doesn't start until a little bit late. And you can see through here that I've kind of made these two fit on the grid and then pushed this one a little bit late. And that was kind of just like a creative choice to try to figure out how to get more swing, but I honestly don't want you to pay attention to that. I'm explaining it for the sake of being thorough, but what's even more important is that we are using something amazing called the time shift. So not only with that snare that I was talking about from before did I not really want sidechained, but with the time shift or track delay, if you're in something like Ableton, it allows you to push everything either a little bit late or a little bit early. And so if you were to turn this off and we were to listen to this, you might be able to tell the difference about how dramatic the shift in the vibe of the beat is. So let's go ahead and listen to the beat on its own, and then we'll turn on the time shift. Now let's go ahead and turn on the time shift. Huge difference with that. So that's something that even if you put everything on grid, you can kind of throw some time shifts onto everything and kind of just experiment with pushing everything a little bit late or a little bit early. You can also highlight the clips and do it manually. So as opposed to having something say like this, you can just push it off a little bit and vice versa. But I find that I do a little bit of both, and that helps me come about these grooves that I've been having just a ton of fun making, even if they don't turn into finished songs or whatever. They're just beats, and that's super fun. So with that being said, hopefully you've seen the process about how you can go from literally nothing, throwing a sine wave in there with a little bit of FM and experimenting with some effects in order to get cool percussive lines. And this is the introduction to my own personal take on how I come about making music in this genre. So if you guys are interested, consider becoming an Arcanum member for how the other drums that I've made in this are made. And then I will be exploring and making more content for that on how to like go about finishing the other stuff like the bass and whatnot. So yeah, thanks guys. I really appreciate it. Check out alckemy.com for presets like this as well. And I will see you in the next one.